If statements. In this video, we will learn how to use booleans to create if statements. So far in this course, we've worked only with sequential statements, which are statements that get executed exactly once in the order that they are written. In this video, we will introduce the if statement, which is a construct that executes a set of conditional statements only if a certain condition is true. Here's how an if statement is written. We start by typing the keyword if, followed by a condition, then a colon. Now, what is a condition? A condition is one of three things. It can be a Boolean value, i.e. true or false. It can be a Boolean variable, or it can be a Boolean expression. Now, we've already seen examples of a Boolean value and a Boolean variable in previous videos. We'll discuss Boolean expressions in the next video, but for this video, we're just going to focus on examples containing a Boolean value or a Boolean variable. So, after completing the first part, we'll then move our cursor to the next line, then press the Tab key to indent once. We'll then write our conditional statement. This is the statement that will execute if and only if the condition is true. In Python, it is a requirement that your conditional statement is indented one level. If you don't indent it, the Python interpreter will not consider a conditional statement, which can lead either to an error message or your program not working as you intended. Now, let's look at an example. As mentioned earlier, a condition could simply just be a Boolean value. So for this first example, I'll use true, the keyword true, as my condition, and then the conditional statement will simply be to print hello world. This is the statement that prints out if the condition is true. Now in Python, when I type if true, that's equivalent to me saying if I flip a quarter and get either heads or tails. If that's my condition, then obviously I'm guaranteed to win because anytime you flip a coin, you're always going to get either heads or tails. So that's essentially what I'm doing in Python when I type if true. I'm basically guaranteeing that the conditional statement will be executed. Thus, when I run this program, hello world will print out every single time, 10 times out of 10. Now, conversely, suppose I wrote if false. Writing if false in Python would be like me flipping a coin and saying, hey, if I get neither heads nor tails, then do this. Obviously, I'm always going to lose because when you flip a coin, you're guaranteed to get one or the other. So here in this case, by me writing if false, I'm basically guaranteeing that the conditional statement will not get executed because the condition is always going to be false. Now, let's examine an example where the condition is a variable. Suppose I have a variable called has_pet and I set it equal to true. Then from my if statement, I write if has_pet colon, print nice. Basically what I'm saying here is if the variable has_pet stores the value true, print nice, exclamation point. Now, since I stored true inside that variable back in line 1, the condition will evaluate to true and thus the print statement, the conditional statement, will get executed. Now, suppose I set has_pet to false back in line 1. Well, in that case, the condition would be false, which in that case, the conditional statement would not get executed, and thus nothing would get printed out. The next point is, in Python, we can have more than one conditional statement. Here in this program, I state that if has_pet stores the value of true, then execute two conditional statements. Both will be seen as conditional as long as they're both indented. So thus, when I execute this program, it creates the variable has_pet, sets it equal to true. Then when I get to my if statement, it sees that the value has_pet is storing the value true. Thus, both print statements will get executed. Now, had I set has_pet equal to false in line 1, then the condition would be seen as false, and thus neither of the print statements would get executed. Now, suppose I added another print statement to this program. However, I did not indent that statement. That means that this statement is not conditional. It does not belong to the condition on line 2. So it's going to execute regardless of what value is stored inside the condition. So when we run this program, sure, has_pet is equal to false, thus the condition is false. So the first two print statements will get skipped over, but the final print statement will still get executed because again, it's not conditional. It's not a part of the if statement. Now, had I set has_pet equal to true, in that case, the condition in line 2 would evaluate to true, so the first two print statements would then get executed, followed by the third one because, like we stated, it gets executed regardless of what the condition evaluates to. So, quick review. An if statement is a construct that executes a set of conditional statements only if a certain condition is true. If the condition is false, then it does nothing, and the Python interpreter will simply move on to the next statement. While this may be good enough for some applications, for other applications it may not be. For other applications, we may also want a certain set of statements to get executed if the condition is false. To achieve this, we'll need an if-else statement. An if-else statement is a construct that executes a set of conditional statements if a certain condition is true, and another set of conditional statements if the condition is false. This is also known as a two-way statement, since there are two directions the program could go in, depending on whether or not the condition is true or false. Let's illustrate this with an example. Suppose I have a variable called isExempt, and I set it equal to true. Then in the next line, I start my if statement using isExempt as my condition. I state if the variable isExempt stores the value true, then print out you are exempt and great job. This is the code that will execute if the condition is true. Next, I'm going to write the code that will execute if the condition is not true. I do that by first writing else and a colon, followed by the code that I want executed if the condition is false. And notice that I indented on both of those statements because they're both conditional. They're both dependent on the condition being false. Then in the next line, I backward indent and write the next statement that's not conditional that'll be executed regardless of the value of the condition. Now, since I set isExempt to true back in line 1, that means my condition will evaluate to true, and thus you are exempt and great job will get printed out, followed by any other questions which is not conditional, thus is going to get printed out regardless. Now, suppose I had set isExempt equal to false. In this case, the condition will evaluate to false, and thus the conditional statements belonging to the if statement will not get executed. It'll get skipped over, and then the Python interpreter will move to the else keyword and print the statements associated with the else keyword, which are you are not exempt and sorry, followed by any other questions, which is not conditional and thus gets printed out regardless of the value of the condition. Now, what if-else statements have in common with if statements is that they both rely on a single condition. What gets executed depends on the value of a single condition. However, what if I were to ask you what's being served in the lunch cafeteria today? Well, the answer to that doesn't depend on a single condition. It'll depend on if it's a Monday, or if it's a Tuesday, or if it's a Wednesday, or a Thursday, or if it's a Friday. And since different food is served on each day, that means we would need different code to be executed for each of those conditions. This is an example of a situation where we would need a multi-way statement. A multi-way statement is a construct that contains two or more conditions, each with its own corresponding set of conditional statements, and executes only the set whose corresponding condition is true, or none of them if all of the conditions are false. So let's illustrate this concept with an example. Suppose I have a variable called hasA that stores whether or not a specific student has an A in the class. A second variable named hasB that stores whether or not that student has a B in the course. A third variable called hasC that stores whether or not that student has a C in the course. And a fourth variable called hasD, and a fifth called hasF. Now, obviously in the real world, it's impossible for a single student to have all 5 letter grades in a single class, but that's not important right now. We'll worry about that later in the video. For now, we're just going to focus on how to write a multi-way statement. Now, a multi-way statement always starts with the if keyword, the if statement. So we say, all right, if the variable hasA is true, then we'll print out you got an A. We then follow that up with an elif statement. The keyword elif is short for else if. It means else if hasB stores true, then we'll print you got a B. Else if hasC is equal to true, print you got a C. Else if hasD is equal to true, print you got a D. Else if hasF is equal to true, print you got an F. Now let's examine how the Python interpreter would interpret this. So we start by, as we said before, creating 5 variables. We're setting each of them to true. Then the Python interpreter goes to the initial if statement. It sees that the condition for the initial if statement is true, so it executes its corresponding conditional statement and then skips the rest of it. Because again, it only evaluates that code if the initial condition was false. Since the initial condition was true, all the other else if statements got skipped over. Now, suppose I set the has a variable equal to false. Well, in that case, when the Python interpreter gets to the initial condition, it sees that it's false and thus will skip over its conditional statement and go on to the second condition. Now that it sees has b is true, it'll print out you got a b and then skip over the remaining conditions. Now let's say I set both the has a and the has b variable equal to false. In that case, when the Python interpreter reaches the first condition, it'll see that it's false and thus will skip over its conditional statement. It'll then look at has b and see it's also false and thus skip over its conditional statement. Then when it reaches the has c variable, it sees that variable is true and thus will print out you got a c, and everything else will get skipped over. Now let's say all of these variables are false. In that case, all the conditions will be false and thus none of the statements will get executed. Now let's go back to the original example where each variable was set to true. As stated before, since the first condition is true, the first conditional statement will get executed and everything else will get skipped. The Python interpreter won't even look at the remaining conditions. Now, let's suppose I were to replace each elif keyword simply with if. Well, this changes the meaning of the programming entirely. Now, each if statement is independent of one another, and the Python interpreter will have to evaluate every single condition regardless of what the values of the other conditions are. So when I run this, the Python interpreter, it'll start with the first condition. It'll see that the condition is true and thus will print you got an A, but it won't stop there. It's going to also check all of the other conditions because, again, each of these if statements are independent of one another. And since all 4 of those conditions are true, all 4 of their conditional statements will get executed. A common mistake programmers make, especially at the beginner level, is using the if keyword in situations where they really needed to use the elif keyword, which leads to the program executing code it otherwise should not have had to execute. Now, let's bring those elif keywords back. And let's also retouch on the point we brought up earlier about how it's impossible for a single student to have all 5 letter grades for a single class. Moreover, suppose I wanted to know your grade in geometry. And I asked, hey, did you get an A? And you told me no. Then I asked, well, did you get a B? And you said no. And then I asked, well, did you get a C? And you said no. And then I asked, okay, well, did you get a D? And you once again said no. In that case, is it necessary at that point for me to ask if you got an F? Or is it reasonable for me to just assume you must have gotten an F? The latter. At that case, if I know you didn't get an A, a B, a C, nor a D, I don't need to ask you if you also got an F. I can already assume you got an F because I know that's the only other possibility left. So really, taking reality into account, having an elif statement that checks the value of the hasF variable is unnecessary. Because if the other 4 conditions are false, well, an F is the only other possibility. Thus, for that last elif statement, rather than checking the value of the hasF variable, we can simply replace that with else. When we replace elif with else, we're saying, hey, if each of the conditions above this else statement are all false, then just go ahead and execute this final statement. You can think of it like a default statement. This default statement also eliminates the need for a hasF variable, so we'll just go ahead and remove it. Now, let's say we were to set all 4 of the remaining variables to false. What will happen is the Python interpreter will go to the first condition, see that it's false, so it'll skip over its conditional statement. See that the second condition is also false, thus skip over its conditional statement. See that the third condition is also false, and thus skip over its conditional statement. Then see that the fourth condition is also false, and this will skip over it, and then it'll reach else. And else statements don't have a condition. Whenever the interpreter reaches an else, it simply goes straight to its conditional statement and executes it. So in this case, you got an F would get printed to the screen.